so Francine is going to start us off.
Yeah, definitely. Welcome everyone. Again, we're so grateful to our panelists and the people who have come to attend for coming to our first talk. This is a two-part series, and this talk is titled Art and Sustainability Under an Equity Lens. So I'm really happy to introduce Andrea, our moderator. We have had such a wonderful experience with her last year, and we're so excited to welcome you back into Heaven Gallery. You're such an amazing person. A little bit about Andrea is that she is a graduate of Northwestern University with a master's degree from Ruiz University. You've worked on the corporate side of the nonprofit world your entire career as a project manager and administrator. You've been an active member of Chicago's literary community. Notably, you're currently working at the Literary Guild Society.
Guild Literary Complex.
Guild Literary Complex, thank you so much. And your work has been published in the past in poetry journals and anthologies, from Tia Chucha's press as Power Lines and Straight Bullets. And her poetry was also included in the Steppenwolf theater production, Words on Fire. You're currently working on a book of memoir poetry and prose inspired by your experience growing up on the city's west side.
So thanks, Heaven Gallery, for inviting me. This is something that Alma posed to me, and we had such a great conversation about it. And it's so funny because as we were having that conversation, we started talking about Wicker Park. And I thought I was going in the Wayback Machine, but she was right there with me. She knew all the spaces and all the places, and I was like, we're kin. Like we grew up. This is sort of my literary high school, if you want to say, because across the street we used to be the Note or the Blue Note, where the Guild used to have its regular sets of readings, and Lit X was over there, and Estelle's. So that was like my whole week. The weekends were for like normal stuff. Weeknights, you did poetry, you pretended to smoke cigarettes, you hung out with your friends, and the interesting thing for me is that I sort of moved away from it after a certain amount of time because I had a kid. And so as much as I enjoyed hanging out during the week, there was that whole daycare and school thing. And moved away from it, and eventually got back into it through my affiliation with the Guild Complex. So this is sort of, I don't want to say full circle, but I feel really comfortable being in this setting, being in the neighborhood and having the conversation about how this neighborhood was someplace, a playground, and what it looks like now. It's good to know that Heaven Gallery is still a space that welcomes artists in the area that's come, shall we say the G word, a little bit gentrified. So I want to make sure I give everybody else a chance to sort of introduce themselves. Alma we know from Heaven Gallery, and Denise from
The Honeycomb Network.
And then this is Teresa and Ruiz.
No, this is Ruiz. I'm Teresa.
Teresa.
Sorry, Denise Ruiz. I'm Teresa.
Yes.
This only happens when I'm not drinking. This is Teresa. I apologize for the last name.
From the Chicago Artists Coalition.
And then Robert.
McKay from Connect Gallery.
Connect Gallery. Excellent. So we're here to talk about a little bit about gentrification, and then just what that does to the community. What does that do for the art that's in the area? Anybody want to start?
I think one of the important things for us to talk about, and I feel like a lot of people don't see it this way, but the violence of gentrification, this
Cutting.
Yeah, it is the cutting
Right.
and ripping.
Right. The things that exist can't exist anymore. And it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? So it's like little things. It's not like they come in and they just sort of stab you in the heart. It's the little things, like suddenly this new neighbor is here, or suddenly the rent goes up, or suddenly there's competition that didn't exist before, or suddenly parking that was a lot easier becomes suddenly not available or less cost effective for the people who come into the neighborhood. So we know that one of the things that brought people into an area, for example, like Wicker Park, back in the day, it was known for having a number of galleries, not just like a few, but like all the galleries existed in Wicker Park. If you were an artist, as a matter of fact, the Wicker Park Arts Festival started because of the galleries, and then there was like this literary scene that came about. Denise, Honeycomb Network is like sort of sandwiched. You were in the sweet spot between. Yeah, so all that stuff on the vision, it's like suddenly it's like Clemente comes up and then it's like, okay, we're back in the neighborhood again. And then we get to Humboldt Park. So you've got like that nice little sweet spot where you are. How's that for you?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I think, I feel like the Honeycomb Network is very much a space of resistance in a lot of ways. I'm from the community. I'm from the community of Humboldt Park and Logan Square, to be honest. But like, you know, we've been fighting gentrification for a really, really long time. And when we think about Wicker Park, even, I'm thinking about even further back when Wicker Park was the hood, and my father was playing basketball, you know, on the courts, and you know, it was very much a Puerto Rican community as well. There was Division Street riots that took place actually in Wicker Park. So when we're talking about gentrification, this has been a long-standing battle, especially for our community in the Puerto Rican diaspora. Started in Lincoln Park, then Wicker Park, and now we're having it happen in Humboldt Park and also Logan Square. So, you know, I think that having that space is such a blessing and a gift, and it's also a great responsibility. It's a real space of resistance, and it's hard, you know, because we're really battling up against a lot of different elements, like kind of like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. It has disenfranchised so much of our community that we don't even qualify for certain grants, certain types of assistance, because those people who are left are sort of erased. Like, that's not a needed, you know, that's not a neighborhood in need anymore, because so much of the people have been pushed out. But there's so much erasure in that, and that's really that sort of like trickling effect of how they really push people out, that final thing where they don't give any more resources, any of that. And so the Honeycomb to me is a space of resource for us, a space of reflection and remembrance for us, and for the community that is coming in, so that they know our names, and they know our history, and they know all the battles and the wars that we fought in this space. And so that's really what it is for me to be in that place, in between flags that just got made into landmarks, as they should, and you know, just, you know, working towards a place of love, but also a place of resistance.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I'd like to speak on that a little bit. Rob McKay from Connect Gallery, and I'm also the festival director for the Silva Block Party. Eric Williams and others have been friends for years. Our approach to gentrification, because we have viable businesses, gentrification is, when we talk about it, I'm sorry, I'm under the weather right now as well, so forgive me. Just that I have my it's communities not being considered, and that is very saddening. You know that historically, Black and brown people have not been considered at every level. That lack of consideration sometimes turns on itself in the community, and we don't begin to consider each other. And when that happens, we fail to empower ourselves. Gentrification happens when the community isn't empowered and informed. Growth in community change is always going to happen. But to be empowered in the community and have a seat at the table, make a seat at the table, that's when you can control the damage. you know? So speaking of, bringing people together, getting the community to actually understand how it should function in love, and also recognizing the whole community, from the bodega, small store owners, kids in school, even the drug dealers in the community, because they all make the community work. But you have to understand, even the drug dealer, you can create change through him. There's value because they're part of the community. You can change it, yes. It's very important. You don't want that element in your community, but you can definitely change it by and I'm using the drug dealer, because in the community, that's kind of like, that's a black, nobody wants that in the community. But to engage, have conversation with him, show what you're trying to do, and also hold him accountable or them accountable for things. And as it grows, so say for instance, I used to live, a long time ago, I used to live on 63rd and Edmonds. It was the hottest block in the city back in like 94. And the block that I lived on, and I moved there because a friend of mine purchased a building with many units. And he asked me, he was like, man, come on over here, help me out. Let's start building this community. I'm like, all right, I'll move over there. I moved over. I had 2 young, children. I was married. And you just look around and you see all the things that are not good in the community. But the block, they have a block club, and they would save the money and they would go to the casino. And I'm like, this doesn't make sense. I'm like, there's an empty storefront down the street. That money should go to lease this building and make a grocery store, because the kids are walking around with flaming hots eating, that's breakfast, But if you don't have the money, guess what? Guess who does? The drug dealer.
Right.
Bro, let's invest in the community. Begin to change his mindset too. It takes, it's a long game, it's definitely a long game, but to include everyone in it.
But when you talk about the idea that the neighborhood is a network, and it's different levels, right? So it's the woman who sits on the porch and watches the block every single day. It's the candy lady. This is me from back in my day. It's the candy lady, the woman who sold candy or food out of her door. It's the cart, the fruit cart, or the corn guy, whatever. It's
But from the beginning, I'm sorry, everybody should be considered.
Exactly.
Every single person in your community should have some type of consideration.
That's the whole idea of the network, right? And when you talk about how they come in, and I said death by 1,000 cuts, they come in and they displace this person and this person and this person. It's the first person on the block who sells their house.
Man.
And that when they do that, it's like, oh,
the floodgates open.
Right, because it's like, well, I want to get out, or this is, and it has an immediate effect to the network, right? It automatically pulls that person out, for whatever that is, and opens it up, because once that first wound, for lack of a better word, is open, it begins to change everything. So when we talk about, we'll take the G word out, and we'll talk about the idea of development. Robert, you mentioned this, that it's going to change. The neighborhood is going to change. We want it to change, right? We want our neighborhoods to evolve. We want our neighborhoods to grow. We want them to begin to evolve. My question to you, and I'll pose this to Teresa: how does art play a role in that?
So I think the paradox is like what Alma was saying, like these are cuts that are constantly happening. But what happens is, the paradox is resources are getting poured in and then cutting away the blight like you were talking about. And so that's the painful thing, is that resources are now finally coming to the community, but what it's doing is displacing. And part of that displacement is not just your neighbors, but it's also arts, because the resources are not going to art, organizations that have been in the neighborhood and have developed that identity. So the arts, I know a lot of times people blame artists. They're like, artists move into our neighborhood and starts to gentrify, but I think it's used as a tool by development, is that they start to propose the neighborhood as a cultural hub, it attracts more people to move there, and then what ends up happening is those organizations move away because they can't afford to live in that area anymore, or they're no longer wanted there because the land is more valuable to develop it, for condos, or, CAC started off as out of somebody's apartment in the 70s, and they weren't doing residency programs, they were publishing a monthly newspaper with opportunities for artists. And artists paid membership dues to get access to this. And it was actually a really, really helpful resource that was given to that community and built it in that way too, and telling other members about opportunities at different organizations, or how to get health insurance as like a self-employed artist. And after doing that for decades, it started to evolve. And so it was about 2010 when it started to evolve, and it decided that, we can't keep artists here in Chicago, supposedly. Like they leave to go to other cities. And so this is when 2 residency programs were developed for artists who, aren't in museums, they're not in commercial galleries, but they have a way to do professional development. And in order to do that, CAC had to get a space. And they were actually for a hot minute here in Wieser Park on Pier Street. It was called the Coalition Gallery. And then, sure enough, it was way too expensive. And then we moved to Fulton Market. And then Google moved in a block away. Because, Google was told too, like this is a very, creative neighborhood, and tech people want to be around, creatives. And so the building got reappraised. The landlord was like, well, we're selling this building, so we had to move. We couldn't afford to rent anymore. So now we've moved further west, so we're not far from having a gallery. So I think, the arts are responsible. Like if we get pushed out and we're going to another neighborhood, another area, we also have to be responsible in thinking about what was there before. What are we going to do to influence this, good or bad? What are we going to do to give to that community as well? So I think it goes both ways. Arts are blamed, but arts are also responsible to help this too.
Now I've got a curious question, and we're just talking to the panelists for right now, so you can lower your hand. Just with technology, right? Because I feel like, especially in this space, everything's so tangible, but we have technology, so I can see the same image online. I can see the same person perform online. So the nature of place for art, to me, is very important. But I'm old school, so I'm curious, what do you think about that? Because galleries don't necessarily have to exist anymore, right? But there's something tangible about seeing, feeling, touching art. So anybody, what do you think about that?
I was just in Tulsa last weekend, and I was talking to an artist there, Anita Fields, who has been very, just very active in kind of that part of Oklahoma. And as a Native person from the Osage tribe, talked about back then, it was communal. You didn't have the technology to communicate. So everybody lived close together. And then as technology developed, there started to become this just sort of more pulling away from each other. And now what I'm seeing, and I'm hopeful with this, is it's kind of going back. I met another artist there, Yadika, who is now creating a space for Native artists because it's still thought of there as, Native art is what is ancestral, what it was before. And, they're very much alive and active there, so it's going to be dedicated to native contemporary art. But I feel hopeful because I'm the same way. I like the coming together, that flow of ideas. I think that's what's important to art development and ideas. Yes, you can do it through technology, absolutely. I'm just not that person that can sit on Instagram all day. And, yeah, and I mean, I do find it helpful because, I will go home and watch something like that's been recorded, that's like on somebody's webpage or Facebook or YouTube, and learn from that as well. So in a way, I don't miss something too, because I can't be there present. I do get to consume it as a video later on. But I really want people to like Heaven Gallery, like Honeycomb, like Connect, to still have that physical space to bring people together. Because that fluidity is important to not just the artists, but people in the community coming too. Because that's the audience. I mean, that's what we're about, audience engagement. If I'm not doing this for an audience, what am I doing?
Nothing beats this.
Yeah.
Nothing beats being connected to people.
Yeah.
And to have the digital aspect and the technology of it, that's just to move information. It's just to move the information. It's not the experience. This experience, watching it, online, just think when COVID, came and you had like D-Nice DJ. It was cool for 5 minutes. It was cool for 5 minutes. It was great that he did something to bring people together, but you can only do that for so long because the lack of connection, this is how we move. This is how we collaborate. This is how we, everything happens in a space like that. This is very important.
I just want to, co-sign for sure, like what you all are saying. I think I'm a person who's very like an analog girl in the digital world. I'm very resistant many times to that sort of spirit. However, I think that something that I've had to really think about, especially when COVID hit, is how ableist we really are, in our work and the way we move. And I think COVID really sort of exposed the issues that we have in accessibility for folks who don't have the type of abilities that we have, and forced us to be more accessible. And that to me should not be something that should go away. I think it should be integrated. I would hope to eventually have the Honeycomb be a fully hybrid space, to be honest. If I'm going to be speaking on what I would love to see in the future, that's what I would want it to be. We're trying to talk about a cohort to come in to learn about NFTs. That's not everybody's cup of tea, but you know what? We're always the ones left behind on these innovative practices and ideations and wealth, and we need to be informed. We need to have spaces we can learn about it. We need to have accessible spaces so that if somebody has a disability or they're a single parent and they can't afford childcare or transportation, they still have a way to access this information and access this community. And so to me, as much as I feel like I love the space, right? Like, of course, I do think that digital component is very important. It is very needed, and it should not be something that should also be sort of like put on the wayside because we want space.
When you all are talking about that, I had a conversation there in the neighborhood, Danielle from Semicolon, and she had said that what they sell in the store is not enough to sustain the store.
It's true.
But they do a ton of online. She said 90% of their sales are online. So, but it's so critical that she physically is there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's committed to being in that space. And I think the idea of tech gives us an extension. But also, and Alma and I were talking about this, that revenue stream that you don't always get. Like, the beauty of this physical space is that you can access, and like I said, it's tangible, it's something that you can sort of get, and the energy you get from being in the room is in the room, but the fact that somebody from across the country or across the world can also connect and buy art creates an opportunity for the artist that doesn't otherwise exist without technology.
So I'm not against technology at all.
Oh, no, I'm not saying you are.
But to connect with people is valuable all the time. as I stated, it's to move information. So, like you said, people who can't come out and, and move around and have that type of access because of disability or just travel or whatever, can't afford it. Technology is great. And technology does breed new ideas and concepts. But at the end of the day, we have to have this connection because this connection allows us to grow community, to understand each other more so that we can develop other things,
Well, I guess the reason why I bring that up is because as we're talking about our, having gallery, how long having gallery been in the park?
So we've been here for 22 years in this space, but it started in 1997 in Flatiron, so.
Oh, okay, Flatiron. Okay.
Yeah, just to talk a little bit about this idea of technology, I was just in a meeting with the Polsky Exchange, that's an entrepreneurial incubator in Hyde Park, and one of the questions they posed to us was about how do you envision space now that, downtown is becoming empty and there's this abundance of space, this idea of online is destroying brick and mortar, right? So they were asking us that, and my answer to that is that what you're talking about, Rob, is that this need to connect is primordial. This is something that is from the beginning of time. I always talk about the arts as being our first language. Before there was words, there was symbols, there was images, and that was art. That's how we communicated, that's how we developed language. And so when we talk about, is there going to be a need for galleries in the future? Absolutely. So there's this idea of when you're in a room that you can sense the presence of someone, you can sense the energy, you can communicate through the eyes and understand what it is that they're saying to you. And that kind of communication does not translate digitally.
Right, that's true.
And then segueing into this other idea that you're presenting now about these innovative retail models. So I think it's interesting that Heaven Gallery started in this neighborhood in 1997. Silver Room also started in this neighborhood in 1997. And what's interesting about us is that we're very similar in the regard that we carry space in a very unique way. So for Eric, it's a retail space that doubles as a community art space. For us, it's a gallery that doubles as a vintage shop. So just like having the same model but reversed. But so when I got to Heaven Gallery, there was hardly any money coming in. We had negative bank statements. It was always going negative. We were always in the red. So my talent is actually, my background is in fashion design. And there was a art space called Acre who was one of our partners and had a rummage sale here. They made $1,000 in one day. And I was like, okay.
That was a lot of money.
Well, yeah, I was like, okay, $1,000 a day, okay, I'm done. So, we started this vintage sale, and when we started this vintage sale, we learned two different things. The first thing we learned was that we created this revenue stream that could sustain programming, that we weren't going to be dependent on foundations and our funders that are trying to tell us how to spend the money and, always being beholden to them, that we had found some money to have some freedom to do some things. And so that was the first thing we learned. But the second thing we learned was something that was really magical. What we learned was that we found a way to broaden our audience, to engage millennials in the conversations of art, where they weren't, a lot of times when people pass by a gallery, it's a white cube, they find it very intimidating, they're like, oh, okay, I'm not gonna go in there, that's too fancy. Or a lot of people are afraid of things that they don't understand, so thinking about art being these contemporary, deep conversations. But what we realized is that vintage shop created this buffer that made it relatable. that it was like, oh, it's approachable. Look, it's just there. You can go look at it and you can engage with it. And so then we started seeing all of these people, particularly millennials because of our location, but just coming up here and being like, oh, I'm into this. I love this gal. You know what I mean? It was like, I know that that's like a big challenge to all of us as art spaces, is like, how do you engage people? And you know, we did it by accident. So I think that it's interesting.
Well, that's like same thing with Honeycomb, and Teresa and Robert, you can speak to this. Honeycomb is more than just this one thing. Like you go into the space and immediately it's very warm colors and things like that, but then there's a shared work area, and then the second room is like big enough to host events, and there's a small kitchen, and it's like there's an opportunity for all these other things. And I'm sure that when you develop the network, you were very conscious of all the things.
Definitely wanted it to be a space that sort of like took that concept from the tower to the grounds. You know, I really wanted it to be a space that felt beautiful. We deserve to have beauty in our communities and have nice things. And a lot of times what happens with displacement especially is that these nice things come in, but we're not a part of that, you know? And so I really wanted to create a space that felt like almost like homey, you know, like home, like a home, you know, it has that feel to it. It's taking you into consideration in all the ways, you know, like, you know, we center, you know, a lot of wellness as well in the space as well. So to me, art healing is part of that. And so we're looking at you, we're saying, we're thinking about your mental health. That's why we have this therapist in the space. We're thinking about you, that's why we have these herbs and we have this herbalist in the space. We're thinking about you, that's why we're centering your art in this space. That just translates different, and people feel very much a part of that and responsible for that. And there's memberships and people treat it like their home. They wash their own dishes, you know, they're part, sometimes there's members there working while people are, you know, setting up the art. And I like that. Yes, be a part of all that process. Demystify all that, you know, take it from that tower and bring it down, because you know what? Art has been around, like you said, since the beginning, right? Like that's been our first language in many ways. How it became the super elitist academic thing, I don't know. I'm not for that. I'm very much a renegade in these spaces. You know, for me as an artist, as someone from the community who sees the brilliance every day that gets, you know, overlooked, not given the resources, not given that reflection, that's what I wanted it to be. And so when I put those colors in, no, it wasn't gonna be a white cube. No, we're gonna have Caribbean colors in here, we're gonna have plants, you know, we're gonna have beauty, and we're gonna have culture, because that's who we are. And so that's really, you know.
That's great. I'm coming to
come through.
Yeah. So how does the Chicago Artists Coalition and Connect Gallery offer a variety of things?
So we are the white cube. We look white. When you walk into our space, this is an organization that is still predominantly white. What makes it dynamic, though, is that we offer residency programs, and they're protracted. So they're about a year and a half. So it allows our artists to develop relationships, and artists then bring in other artists and friends into the space. So while we are a white cube, I feel like we are approachable because of our openings. Our openings, we would draw like 200 people, sometimes up to 500 people, if we had open studios going on. And I try to directly connect with people in those moments. So obviously there's folks that come who are regulars, and I always want to thank them and show that gratitude that they're making the time to come. But if there's somebody new, or somebody comes up to me and is like, I really love this piece, I'll be like, here's the artist, you know, and go introduce them. So it doesn't feel faceless, you know, and anonymous. You know, even the simple act of when people come during the week, I greet them and I ask them right away, have you been to this space? And if they haven't, you know, let them know what, you know, there's 2 galleries here, if, you know.
Where are you located again?
We are like West Town, but we're in an industrial area. So it's called the Kinsey Industrial Quarter. So it's small manufacturing. A block away is an incubator space for small businesses. So there's a little community there. I mean, there's a small manufacturing communities, buildings. I say hi to them all the time. They're on their little forklifts every morning. And so, you know, I do develop relationships with them. The coffee shop that's there too, I know them. But it's not, you know, dynamic or vibrant like this. this area.
But again, it goes towards knowing your neighbors, right? So
Exactly.
if that neighborhood changes or something's gonna happen, you're connected to those folks because you're
Absolutely.
seeing and talking to them every day.
Yeah.
So, same thing, Robert.
So Connect Gallery, the name is on purpose, so it's all about connection.
And you're located,
1520 East Harper Court, so that's right off of 53rd.
right?
Everything is art to us. We believe that art is the catalyst of social change. And we say, from candles to tuxedos, we want everybody to be connected to the thing that is natural to every individual. Everybody's a creative first. Your environment kind of dictates where you take that, because you look at a three-year-old, they're at their freest moment pretending, and as a parent and as someone older than them, you're supposed to be able to lock in and understand how to nurture that and harness it so that it can grow, so that they can be themselves in life, But we are attached to the other things, and we're told that, no, you should be a lawyer because this is what makes money, But then you have so many lawyers and doctors and whatever that do art as a hobby, and they're great at it. And they love the money. At some point, you're too far in the game, to turn back. But that is actually the first love. So at Connect Gallery, everything is art to us. There's an art gallery, but in our gallery, we started a dance company.
Oh.
We started an orchestra. Our first show, we had a skateboard half pipe in the gallery, because that is a form of art. And I go back to talking about consideration. We consider everyone in the process because we know, or I feel that everybody is creative. So why not give them a platform while showing artwork from children? We've done kid shows, so local, regional, national, and international. We touch it all because we want everyone to experience it all. But we want everyone to actually create and have their own experience, so that like you said, I kind of feel like we're the anti-gallery, having all of the vocabulary and explaining the art. And when you create, you create. That's it. You don't have all of the extra words for something that you just feel is beautiful, regardless if it's, making music. It just comes out of you. Then you have the educators saying, this is what it should be. But it's not always that. I just, Connect Gallery, I've always wanted it to be a space where people can be free in their creative process, period.
So how do we maintain that in our neighborhoods? How do we keep that going? I mean, you're in Hyde Park, you're in West Town, which is sort of the new park, for lack of a better word. And you're in Humboldt Park, you're in Wicker Park. I mean, it was funny, I'll tell the story. So I ran into a poet that I knew, and I was like, hey, what's up? And he's like, hey, what's up? And he's like, I was like, so where are you? He's saying he just moved, and I was like, where you moved to? And he said, East Garfield Park. And I said, East Garfield Park? I said, where you live? And he said, I'm on the street Walnut. And I said, Walnut? I was like, this is where my grandmother's house is. And I said, what part? And he named it, he literally was 5 houses down from my grandmother's house. And he said, East Garfield Park. I said, East Garfield Park? I was like, when I grew up, that was just the west side. It was just, it didn't have a neighborhood name. It was just the west side. Garfield Park, when I was a kid, if you were at Garfield Park, you were too far from home, you were going to get in trouble if somebody saw you that you knew. So it was interesting to me because now that neighborhood, and this is a challenge for my family, is that neighborhood is changing because people have started to sell, but the artists are moving into the neighborhood, right? So, and they're making it home. So now there's this idea that the neighborhood for developers is that it may flip, which represents an opportunity for family, landowners, or whatever to sell their property. It could change Kenzie, where you are. It could change Humboldt Park because even on the drive, if you drive down Kedzie, which is where my grandmother lived, if you drive Kedzie going north, you go from abandoned stores and dilapidated buildings to suddenly, well, wait a minute. So it looks different. So I want to know how artists can still have a place in those communities. How do you root yourself so that displacement is not a possibility?
We're talking about community development now.
Yes. I mean, you know, we talk about the idea of development without displacement. How do you root yourself so that the sweet spot for where you are doesn't suddenly become the hot spot? You know, and how does having gallery sustain itself in this neighborhood with New York type rents? You know, it's bananas.
Well, that's the thing about capitalism, is that it has no respecter of person or respecter of the things that heal us, help us, connect us, create thriving communities.
Before you go there, I want to say something real quick. I don't know if anybody's noticed this, but what is it? Was it Sundays on State or something that they call it?
Mm-hmm.
And what are they doing? They're bringing the artists to State Street. Mm-hmm. So the idea that they need art to build commerce to sustain the area. So going back to that and rooting ourselves, art creates commerce, so why can't we stay?
I think that's the paradox that I was talking about before, is that I think capitalists start to see that it's not going to maybe pull a profit or profit according to them. And I think I think that's just what it is. It's a means to an end. So it's used until it really starts to rapidly develop, and then, you know, there's no regard for keeping that there, that culture, a lot of times. So
I think small, you know, galleries like all of this, I go back to consideration. Being considerate to that creative community empowers the community. When you empower the community, you begin to have conversations about business, understanding all of the things that we are fighting against, but collectively, and we begin to have an understanding. So when companies come in and go to an artist, I'll use musicians as an example. So I work with a lot of musicians as well. And when a tour comes to town, or an artist from another area comes to town, and they want to pick up a bass player or a drum or whatever, they want to get the best artist for the least value, you know?
Right.
And I tell all the musicians, if your rate is $100 an hour, or for a gig is $200, don't go any lower than that. Because, and then if the next musician that is part of this network, if you stay there, and you stay there, when people come to town, they already know that there is a floor that you cannot, you can't shake.
Right.
But there's always one that says, I'll do it for 50. And guess what? He sound like $50 on a bandstand. You know? But you want to bring the community in to show that the value is theirs. You know, because when corporations come and they say, hey, we want to give you money to do this, this, and this, it's coming this way. It's not the value, it's the take. You know, because now the red tape you have to do to get it, and then it's not really what you are trying to, to show. You have to change a little bit.
So as we talk about this, and I'm diverting from this, is, because you bring this up, Robert, is pay equity part of the discussion when we talk about sustaining ourselves in these neighborhoods?
Absolutely.
Because, again, I'm not gonna come to Wicker Park and say, this has value, and then go to Hyde Park and be like, well, it's not the same. You know, I mean, and when I say that, I mean, because we invest in ourselves, right? It's like, well, if this piece is worth this much money, then it's worth this much money. You know?
This is part of the conversation too about gentrification. So say for instance, Coach wants to come into your community, but you know damn well she makes bags just as dope. You know, but we value the name brand,
Right.
then value the maker who's doing great products, equal value. You know, we have to support that.
Well, but at the same time, people go, well, if we bring Coach into the neighborhood, it lifts everybody up. That's the mentality. I'm not saying it's true. They say, Coach
Will bring development.
will bring development, but also legitimizes the space. Well,
Space or whatever.
you know, it's like when I remember when Mac came to Harlem,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a big deal when they put a Mac store in Harlem. And one, because culturally Mac hadn't had products that were for people of color, but it was like, there's a Mac store in Harlem. Mac is like the premier. And Mac, Harlem welcomed that, but at the same time, what did it change about Harlem? I mean, think about Harlem as it is now, because now Harlem is not for us, it's for other people. So, well, I don't live in New York, but that's another story. But I'm just saying that, you know, the idea of corporate, but also it goes towards, because see, and I think that we're talking about art, but the truth of the matter is that you're all small business owners. And so when we talk about being rooted in the community, the small business owner still should have a place in the community even as it develops.
Okay.
So it just happens to be what your trade is or what your commerce is. I love the fact that when you go into the Silva room or when you come into Heaven Gallery or in the Honeycomb, it's not bags. It's art, it's books, it's jewelry, yeah, it's everything. And I always have to applaud because what I see in each of these spaces is that it's well curated, which is an odd term, but it's curated in the sense that it's not just about these one things, but somehow all these things are connected. That everything when you walk into the space is connected. Even when you change exhibits, I love the type of jewelry that gets sold is different, or you know how you. So as a small business owner, we still have to compete. But again, we belong in the neighborhood. We still belong when the community changes, and I think that when we approach development, we have to approach it from the business sense that we're small business owners and that we're what's attracting people to this neighborhood, and that's the reason we deserve a place in it.
Exactly.
So I don't know, and I think maybe, there's neighborhood money now that's going into neighborhoods. There was a survey that I heard about through the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events that Chicago was significantly underfunded.
No kidding.
From an arts perspective, more so than any other large city. Compared to New York, San Francisco, even Seattle. And I was like, Seattle? But the percentage of money that the government, city government, was giving to art was significantly lower than that of another major city like Seattle. And I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because, and maybe it's because it's my view, but that's all you see in Chicago.
Yeah.
This is such a cultural, and people come here because it's so many opportunities for your art to sort of develop, whether you're a musician or an artist or a jewelry maker or a clothing maker. It just, there's an abundance of opportunity. So again, art sustains commerce from a business perspective. So how do we make sure that we stay viable? How do we make sure, you mentioned NFTs, offering workshops. The Silva Room is a great example of something that sort of started like this small thing, and you guys are rent space on Oakwood Beach. You know, and creating a model, you know, that people sort of have, but, and I, you know, the pushback about a $50 event that was free all along, and I was just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
You know, suddenly it doesn't have value. Suddenly you can't put a dollar amount on all the stuff that you've been getting free for years. This big cultural event, which it was a cultural event, and suddenly you want to put a dollar amount. You put a dollar amount on it, people are like, well, that's just too much. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because it's still the same cultural event, except now you got to pay for it. You know, why does art have to be free?
I think this goes back to this idea of exploitation of the arts. So there's so many, the city thinks there's so many of us that they don't need to invest in us. There's an abundance, you know, we're like weeds. But the truth is the only way that we're ever going to have power is through ownership. That's just the truth. And to make those decisions for ourselves. I think about Equity Arts. So Equity Arts is this project that I started 5 years ago to buy and redevelop this building. And, you know, our idea is, well, what happens if the arts owns itself? What happens then? What happens if all of the cultural equity that we create in a neighborhood is owned by us? You know, what happens when you tap the creative economy to funnel into programming that a community needs instead of just going under the radar as nothing and oh yeah, that can just be erased and displaced. So I think that we're really thinking about how do you reposition ourselves as the artists? How do we reposition ourselves in the market, right?
But it goes back to, you're not just positioning yourself as
Repositioning, yeah.
Repositioning, you're saying we're a legitimate business entity and we're viable and you should pay attention to us. And I think that people think art does not equal a business. But again, you're all small business owners. So art is just a trade. It just happens to be the trade. You are smart enough to be able to do any number of things, no different from the restaurateur or the coach, but then you say, we want to take this and we want to make this, we want to invest in the business of art. And I think that we have to change, and maybe this is me, but maybe we have to change the language developers speak. Because they don't think of artists necessarily as, it's like, for whatever reason, creatives are not business people. But the truth of the matter is, and this is one of the reasons why you have to say, I come from the fashion industry. I've been doing this for 20 years. I created this alternate revenue stream. This is the model that we created so that to sustain this, we did this. That's a business decision. And if you were a white male offering that opportunity in a business environment, somebody would be like, well, that's just genius. Well, that's just a, you know, it's the difference between an arthritis drug and what is now called Viagra. Because Viagra was created as an arthritis drug. It was just to help with arthritis. And one of the side effects was that they had these 4-hour waits. And they said, well, why are we selling this drug for arthritis when we can make this huge money on this? It was just a different form of thinking. And here you are saying, I'm going to take this space and I'm going to make it something for it that's going to sustain the neighborhood, the art in this neighborhood. I want to talk also a little bit about the idea of shared resources because Honeycomb offers that opportunity. I know your creative work with Silva and Teresa. How does that benefit? How does that help to sustain or root yourself in the neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, our mission is to help artists live, work, and thrive. And so we advocate for artists. You know, we have a lot of people come to us that are like, oh, we want to work with an artist to do a mural or to do art for our office space, and nobody wants to pay for it, So we always advocate. We say, well, what's your budget? That's the first question. If they don't have a budget, then the conversation ends there. Sometimes they say, well, can you help us develop a budget? And we do that work, and then they're like, oh, no, that's too much. And so I think what we try to do is want to advocate for artists. The residency programs is professional development, so it is to push their career forward. We offer artist grants as well, and oftentimes, because the residencies are longer, artists over time decide to collaborate with one another after the residency program. So they start to lay down roots, or they create spaces of their own. They self-organize, and so I think that's a way of self-reliance, and it starts within a community. That doesn't, maybe, like the city probably thinks like that doesn't translate to dollars, but it does actually, because it brings more opportunity, it enriches the culture that we have here, and I think the part of Thrive in our mission is really about trying to help artists unleash their full creative potential. And I think when they're able to do that, it's helping us reimagine some of these things too. There are artists that are very passionate about art and labor, art and business, and kind of help us also to think through, what are some alternative models. I want to go back to one thing that you were saying about developers, because I think we also have to recognize there are other actors in this, the city. Developers work with the city to get permission and to redefine, a neighborhood with new development. And, DKs, I love Department of Cultural Affairs and special events. But they're kind of, what I learned through them is for the longest time, even the city had its priorities mixed up with the arts. A lot of the funding for the arts went to downtown and to the Loop because it's the commercial hub. So the theaters down there, the cultural center, Art Institute got a lot of money because it pulled in a lot of tourists. And so it was pretty uneven in giving funding to the rest of the city. They're trying now to make amends with that, which I think is great. They finally kind of woke up to that, and they're like, okay, we need to redistribute this money. And especially now with the pandemic, and we see what's happened downtown, they're realizing that they have been neglectful with just other arts organizations that have thrived, have survived the pandemic. So I think when we talk about, we have to see who else is like behind the curtain. It's not just developers, but there's government. The state of Illinois is also very much implicated in this too. So I think we just have to start to, in terms of structural change, which I think is what we're trying to get at, to like really make change happen, we really have to be critical about who's making these moves, pulling these strings that's affecting us and our businesses.
Do you think that, and I'm jumping around, I apologize, corridors or areas, designated areas for the arts, because going back to what Teresa was saying, I think, the tier is theater, right? And then maybe other type dance usually, and then maybe galleries and things like that. My trade is literary art, so it's really at the bottom. It's like, well, people read books, and the books that help write the plays and all the other stuff, that's another story. But do we need those designated spaces, or should we just be like, we're here, we want to be in the same place next to the store and the restaurant or the fire station or whatever?
I think there should be freedom of choice. I think every arts organization is different. They know their identity. I personally would love a corridor. There used to be, like River North used to be like that.
Right.
Fulton Market was for a while too. And I think it's a matter of convenience as well. And it's a way for businesses, arts businesses to have, openings, like open nights to the public. So I would be in favor for that. But I know not every arts organization wants that. Sometimes they're very rooted in a specific neighborhood. And so that's what they're about, and that's who they serve. So I think that choice is great. The corridor, though, sort of also then you start to think about encroachment, because you have a power there, as an arts hub, and then that encroachment starts to happen with.
Well, if you own the buildings,
Yeah, that's true. See, that
Then you're good.
Then you're good if you own the building.
I think the issue with that though, for us as a nonprofit, is that if we own the building and we apply for grants, funders don't want to fund that. They don't want to fund like your rent, roof repairs and things like that. They want to go towards programming, pay for salaries, but it's that stuff that they don't want to pay for. So I think that's another problem I think
When you own property.
when you own property, yeah.
Well, we got them to finally widen up the unrestricted funding. That took forever for us to do. They were always trying to have this funding is for this thing, that's all you can spend it on.
Right.
Now that has lifted, so why can't we lift, okay, we want to create sustainable models that think about the arts indefinitely, that we have ownership models to sustain the arts. I think we can also change their mind in that regard. I think we need to keep pushing for the way that we see the future. I mean, they're looking to us like for the answers. How do we fix our problems? You want to know how we fix our problems? We own our own buildings and we sustain ourselves. Going back to this idea of DCASE, in New York City, I recently read a story about how their equivalent of DCASE is buying buildings and preserving the arts and letting them stay there indefinitely, creating these land trusts that deems the use of those buildings to be for culture and affordability to the arts. So they're doing it. And how behind Chicago is. Every major city is creating these anti-displacement strategies. San Francisco did it. They started buying buildings, leasing them back to the arts, and then selling them to the arts organizations at the principal price that they paid. This is through a partnership through a philanthropic foundation. And then London took that model and created the Creative Land Trust in London, where they started selling bonds to this building to preserve the arts.
Wow.
So they're having all of these innovative ways that they're preserving the arts all around the world. And Chicago is still talking about, oh yeah, should we be funding the arts? How much should we be giving?
Yeah, right. They don't know even where to start. But I mean, again, we have to start by the idea of that art is still. Let's not separate ourselves and say that we're not businesses. So once you start sort of establishing a foothold, feet planted on the ground, and say, I'm a small business, this is how you should fund me. Not, I'm an artist, you should fund me because I support art, but I'm a small business that's going to help sustain your neighborhood. I mean, Honeycomb was it like a laundromat across the street, and then, there's a restaurant a block away or 2 blocks away. So, I mean, Honeycomb is this lotus flower and surrounded by all these other things. And then, you talk about being surrounded by manufacturing, but all the guys that are in the manufacturing area. So the whole idea of we're here and we're here with this foothold in this neighborhood because we support this neighborhood. Once we get away from the idea that it's just artists and then, in quotes, they don't think of businesses. In my mind, and Alma, I'm like just eating up this whole thing, the idea of this building, but I'm always like, who helps the artists do their taxes at the end of the year? Who helps because I sort of, I'm not, unofficially like consult with some baby not-for-profits because they don't even know how to establish themselves as a not-for-profit. Or should you establish yourself as a not-for-profit? Right. Yes.
Don't do it.
But I mean, I'm fresh out of graduate school, I got a good idea, or I should be able to do X. And there's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of the folks in arts administration are accidental tourists. And that's not a negative, it's that you're the person who had the good idea, so you should run it. And it's like, well, I don't know how to run this. I make dresses, or I paint pictures. And so now you're forced to learn how to do that. But what if there was an opportunity in a space that Alma's creating that helps incubate artists beyond their art but also as a business.
It's funny, so that's kind of what we do in the gallery. With starting the dance company, and these are things that I've been wanting to do for a long time. I grew up in a household, civil rights, music. My mom studied opera, and I always was taught about love first, leading in love. So, and also honoring who you are, as an individual and the community that you come from. So, I love everybody, but I'm pro-Black. But that doesn't mean that I'm against anyone. I love everyone, but I know the considerations for our community has been nil, nothing, so that's what I support first. And, but again, like I said, everybody, from candles to tuxedos, everybody is welcome. So I started off playing music, I was in bands and studied piano and clarinet, saxophone, and played instruments. Growing up, for me, it was Miles Davis, Quincy Jones, Stevie Wonder. That's all that I was into, and that was my path, that was my trajectory. Grew up DJing, and then young music, which was house music and hip hop. I was producing that, had recording studios. So I'm saying all of these because as I'm growing, I'm also learning and acquiring different skill sets. And got older, had a recording studio, went to Columbia College, worked for ASCAP for many years, worked at RCA, and then I it shifted, and then I got into the concert thing. So I started off with Jam Productions, and now I continue, but I've always been my own thing. I've never been an actual employee. I've always been a consultant. And early on, a good friend of my family who's into the business, he said, stand on your own, you have a lot to offer. So he's like, always value yourself and get people to see your value just by doing great work and being consistent in doing great work. So now we have this gallery, and like I said, everybody's welcome. So we have artists come in, and then we have kids come in that see themselves doing this thing, but they see that. They don't see the work it takes to sustain it. You have to work at painting, you have to work at producing music. Even though it's fun, it's still a rigor that you have to, you have to develop. So we have these things going, and we start talking about, we have powwows just like this. What's the next move for you? I want to start songwriting. Do you know about publishing? Now we start talking about that, but not just to this person. Everybody in the room is beginning to learn about it, and it sustains itself. So now, out of that, Isaiah Collier, Micah Collier, right. Those are our artists in residence. That's what we call them because they're musicians in the space. But everyone is learning far more than what is presented to an audience,
Right, but that's the whole idea. I mean, Connect Galleries establishing themselves to do that, but how do you make that? I don't want to say how do you make it front and center. How do you make that part of the not just part of the process, but part of the mission? In other words, again, you're all small business people, and I want to stress that because you're still running a business. You're still, even the idea of being a not-for-profit is still, you still have to make money. And so once we sort of walk into the space, not as I'm this artist thing, I am a business person with this particular business model, you should respect me for being the same person as you are, in that I'm offering you this business opportunity. When Alma talks about the building, and very concretely, in the sense of what it can offer and what it can do. It's a business model. Owning land requires you to have a business. And I don't think that people come in, when we talk about development, they don't think of that when they think of artists. They sort of say, we can sweep by them because they don't have this business sense. But the opportunities between Connect and CAC and with Heaven is that if we teach people to put their foothold in, one foot might be this, but you're a small business person, you're in the business of selling something. And it's not about, we say things like your value. And I'm not knocking what you're saying, but it's dismissive in the sense that it doesn't create the idea that you're a business.
No, that's what we are developing. That's what I'm getting at. That those moments, that's what it begins to develop because it's beginning to change the mindset of understanding not just the value, but how it can move you to the next level of ownership of a building. While, because a musician, they have their craft, but that craft to become more than a musician, long-standing, you have to have business acumen as well.
Exactly.
So that's what we're developing.
And that goes to the community.
I was gonna say, one of the ways that we did it was off the jump, we created a cohort. And this was early on during the pandemic. We weren't even open to the public yet in our actual storefront, so it was virtual. And it was a 3-month cohort, and it was for creative entrepreneurs, and it was helping to develop their ideas and also to build that community so that we could support one another, bring our different skills to the table and, help each other in the different places that we were at in our businesses. It was all of them were entrepreneurs, creative entrepreneurs. So we started that. We've done, this is going to be a third cohort, with this cohort being about NFTs, but it was that one. The second cohort we did, we brought in a lawyer, we brought in a marketing person, we brought in an accountant, because these are things that a lot of times we're not thinking of. These are not the sexy things of entrepreneurship and business, right? But these are the nitty-gritty details that many times bring businesses under because they're not wanting to face it as overwhelming, or you just don't know. And so I think for me, with the Honeycomb, one of the bases and the roots of it is accessibility. And there's always this tension, right, between we want to thrive, but we also want to be accessible. We want to thrive, but we also want to be collective. And we want, to take care of ourselves, but we also want to take care of each other. And so how does that look? And how do we offer reciprocity? How do we create generative cohorts and conversations? When our artists come in and they're a part of a show or a residency, they are also giving workshops to the community. Offering, sliding scale or different types of workshops as a way to, again, give back, skill share. We've had, I've had Sam Kirk come in and teach young artists about contracts and the importance of that, because that's something in it right there. A lot of times artists, we just want to shake hands and vibe, and it's no, you gotta have a contract. I promise you gotta have a contract.
Explain to somebody what an invoice was, and I'll be like, how do you not know what an invoice was?
Because we come from, I think, a place and a culture that in order for a lot of our communities to survive, we had to do these kind of things. We had to haggle, we had to, figure out ways to pinch pennies. So I understand the mindset sometimes to want to do that, even within artists of our community. One, we feel like we can, because there are people, right? Two, we just want access to things that everybody else has access, and we don't have those means and those resources. We're going to do what we can to try to have that conversation. But I also think that it's also changing that culture and really showing what it could look like when we invest in one another, when we invest in these spaces, when we invest in our artistry, and also when we invest in a community that's also interested in what we have to give. What are we giving back to them? How are we being reciprocal? Artists are very exploited. I came in this as an artist myself. I'm not like a painter artist. I was a poet, writer. I did a lot of the things, went to a lot of those spaces. And then, got into jewelry making and, mixed media art, and then was, running spaces and curating spaces. And so I see both sides of that. I've been in that hustle grind, vendor, going to spaces where they barely even ask you if you want, you need a glass of water, because you're just there to service. And so I really wanted to have a different type of environment at the Honeycomb to show that, no, one, it's Black, Indigenous, people of color centered, period. So anybody's welcome, just like, we say. However, that's who we're centering. That's who's going to be on our walls. That's who's leading our workshops. That's who's leading our programming. And it's so important because of this same situation that we find. We're constantly looking outside of ourselves for solutions. Oh, the city. Oh, the developers. Oh, the white people. And that's all real and valid. But how are we working within ourselves to, build and create coalition that's really intentional and very real and not surface and not just saying it because it sounds good. I found that, doing this work, a lot of people talk about collaboration, but many don't really understand what that means, and what it means to intentionally collaborate so that you're both benefiting, And I think that's what it is. It's just like sort of creating that space to give and to receive, to understand that everybody has something to teach and something to learn. That's why I like this space in and of itself, just being in this circle, because there's things that somebody here knows way more than I do and vice versa, And I think that when we come to the table in that way with our communities and we show them that we see them and that they're valuable, not because of what they produce, but because of who they are, then that's where you're going to get that traction. That's when you're going to get that buy-in, and that's when you're going to find those roots to grow.
How do you express that, though, to the other side? Because...
What other side?
To the building owner across the street, or to the, because who owns the building, the Honeycomb?
I don't own it.
No,
Hopefully one day, but
no, what I'm saying that you have to, in other words, when you decided on that space, you have to negotiate, and you have to understand what, and for those who might be building owners, if you buy a building, right, and you say, I'm going to buy a building, it's going to be a 2-flat, it's going to be a 3-flat, I need X amount of money to cover my mortgage. So it has nothing to do with having tenants, right? You don't care if people live downstairs, but they're paying to support this. So the reason I bring that up is because you have to sort of, going back to the idea of revenue and alternative revenue streams and shared resources. In other words, if I have an accountant that I think is wonderful, and Alma says, I'm having a tough time with X on my books. You know what? My account's really great. I'll let them know that you need somebody. And now you and I are working with the same person. And they can help us mutually. Or if somebody is like, I need to figure out how to work this contract, or I need to figure out how to manage this rent because he's saying that after 5 years, or I get X, and you're like, wait a minute, I don't understand that. I need somebody else to look at that. And I'm like, you know what? I know a lawyer. Or how do we, in other words, we can strengthen each other.
Have to be a source and a resource.
Exactly. What do I have that's working for me that I can share with you instead of us being in competition? We're all gallery owners. We're all business people. So how do we support each other in that aspect of it, that aspect of the work? Not necessarily relying on, because, Chicago Artists Coalition, they were like, well, I need an accountant. Call Chicago Artists Coalition. They were like, and they say, well, we don't know an accountant, but X, this group, and this group uses this group. And that's how it would get into the Chicago Artists Coalition. That's so funny because I don't think of you guys as like supporting art. Really? And because back in the day it was one of those. It was like a support mechanism. It was like if you needed something, you went to Chicago Artists Coalition because they knew the thing that you needed. So how do we get wine for free or for our event, or how do we get this? And you're like, well, Chicago Artists Coalition, they should know something. Even Chicago Arts and Business Council offers services through volunteers. There's another organization called Catch a Fire that's sponsored by Chicago Community Trust and offers a chance for you to do the things that you need to do to support you as a business person. And I think that we tend to sort of go, and this is always the sort of nomadic, kung fu for, nobody knows what I'm talking I want to say kung fu. TV show called this sort of nomadic lone warrior story that you have to do everything yourself, and by the time I tell somebody how to do it or what I want done, I could have done it myself.
That's me.
And I'm like, I'm not a QuickBooks person, so you know what? Let me find somebody who does. And once you understand that this is where I am weak and this is where you are strong, then you become a resource, right? Because I can offer this to you, and maybe in return you can offer this to me. But that's that collaboration thing. It does, and I have said this to my son in his love relationships, that balance doesn't always mean equal. When we talk about reciprocity, it's not necessarily about 50-50.
Right.
Sometimes you give more than you take, but that's going to circle back to you in a different kind of way.
Because it's about positioning too.
Exactly. It's about building that network. So if Alma has this, and she knows Eric from the Silva room, and she knows Teresa from CAC, then there's an opportunity there to show all of this, to fill this space with all this wonderful art, because I have these connections through these other people. So maybe I wouldn't be able to get that artist otherwise to do a showing in my space, but now they are because I'm connected to this person, which may elevate, it may elevate your space to be able to say, I'm showing so-and-so's work. And I'm just giving you an example of something. But the idea of reciprocity and being a resource for other people, again, roots ourselves back in the idea of community and as business people.
And also the solidarity economy. I think that's one of the things when you talk about reciprocity that is at the center, putting people first, putting the planet first. I think it's interesting the way we are also talking about these circular models of regenerative mentorship, which is something that we're really interested in. So we used to do this internship program. We realized that we were creating people who were learning how to run a nonprofit art gallery using an innovative retail model, showing them how to put up a show, how to write a grant, how do you keep up with your books, how do you do this? And when we were doing that, we were actually creating the next generation of social entrepreneurs. So just really leading by example and being intentional about what you're talking about, like that we're creating the next generation. And that's how we're pushing against the system and disrupting the system by making people think like, okay, I can use this thing that's going to funnel money into this
Right.
and make social impact that way.
But again, those are the kinds of things that keep you rooted in the community, right? It says that I have value. It's for every internship you offer, which is, a chance to develop a younger person that may in turn create another business in that community. It's self-sustaining, right?
Right.
That's the goal, that we, so that the person who comes out of your program says, I might not create a gallery, but I might create a store that happens to sell art. So they may flip it and say, instead of being a gallery, I'm going to be retail and I'm going to sell art outside in addition to these other products. It's taking the idea of a business space, and then turning it into a block club party. It's taking the idea of a resource, it was just a newsletter. It was like, there was no internet. You just sort of opened up the paper and it was like, guitarists wanted to the thing that you are now. That's allowed for a long-term growth that's rooted in the community, but also sustaining itself by offering those opportunities. For every Isaiah Collier you create, or Michael Collier you create, they're going to do the same thing for somebody else. Or they're going to go and say, if you want to learn, go here.
And that is what we're trying to nurture and harness.
Right.
I think for cultures that consideration to not be there for so long, it implodes on the culture, where now when you say, I can do this for you, there has to be a trust factor there too. to bring them in and to begin a collaborative growth process. So then you can start imparting information, and then they're like, oh, you keep showing up, giving and sharing, you know, now I'm in. Now they begin to take in what you're giving and sharing, now they're going to spread it to the next person.
I'm still trying to get to the thing, because you all are so unique in what you offer, but at the same time, how do I get that to translate to a developer that I need to stay?
I don't think you can convince them. I think they're just.
So you're the cynic.
I mean,
We need to do it on our own.
Idealist way. No, it's
No, I'm kidding.
they're very much directed at profit, you know, and they don't see how the nonprofit is profitable. So they, like I said before, use it as a tool, as a means to an end.
And I agree, because really, developers, again, like she said, we want the money at the end of the day, you know? So my stance is, if we're a group of artists and we do dope shit all the time, we will always find a space to do it.
Well, that's true, but I'm gonna not fight back, but I'm gonna counter that with the idea that Hyde Park is solidified as a community by the University of Chicago. So that's not gonna change. They rely on small businesses to support the students. There's always gonna be that support, neighborhood support, because there's always gonna be new people coming into the neighborhood kind of thing. If you go past Washington Park on the other side to where the Astro Gates created the artist block, it's in a weird spot. You know, I dig it. It's in a weird spot, but I know that, like, for example, the restaurant next door has gone through several iterations. We want to connect that as, you know, it's this artist, part of this artist community, and we want to grow it as a hub. And what they've done is say, we're going to add the things that need to be added. So there's the artist space, the incubator, there's a restaurant, and so they put a theater there because those two places will support the restaurant. In theory.
Universities in control of those things.
Well, that's
I'm building a community to buy and control their own narrative.
But you have this root that's there. What roots, Honeycomb, what roots Helen Gallery that doesn't force developers to say, I'm going to change it? And that's the question that I'm asking, is like, how do you say, because what happens is they say, oh, they use art as a placeholder, and they say, well, now that we've got some character in this area, it's a good artist community, let's bring in the condos. You know, where you're talking about it as a meatpacking community. You know, and they're still there, but now there's like condos and stuff around it. So
I think it's a difficult thing, you know. I think these are things that we're navigating in like real time. For me specifically, I can speak to that. You know, I think what I have advocated for myself when I got the Honeycomb space, I spent a month negotiating with the landlord, a month, with them sending me things and me sending it back, and going back and forth. And we renegotiated again last year because of some stuff. And so I'm constantly. I think that we need to have advocacy, of course, but I think that ultimately the community is what keeps you around. If you're rooted in that way, and that community comes out and they support you, then you're gonna make it.